So, as Anna said, my name's Joe Schulz, and I'm training evangelist at Orasi. I'm here to talk about how to move Tableau training online. So, usually when I'm talking about this stuff, I'm talking to trainers, to professional trainers. And I know that a lot of you guys are practitioners and consultants and things like that too. So what I've tried to do is tailor this presentation to focus specifically on things that, are more relevant to, like informal lunch and learn sessions or team training or something like that. Maybe if you had to teach some of your coworkers how to use a Tableau dashboard that you just built for them, for example. So hopefully it'll be interesting to everybody, not just to trainers in the crowd. And I do have some experience in this area, and I went through that kind of marketing blur. But the point is I've been a certified Tableau trainer for a long time. And I've taught literally hundreds of Tableau desktop classes all over the country. And those classes were almost all in person. At the very beginning, that's all I ever did was in person. But now, of course, they're all online in the last 6 months. So I do have to do a little bit of practicing what I preach. Also, I was told by my marketing team that I've got to include one fun fact about myself. So I'll just mention that I went to college at 15 and got my first degree from Notre Dame at 18. So the reason I tell you this is because I know you're thinking to yourself right now, man, how could he have so much experience and be so good looking and be so young in his picture, right? That's what you're thinking. That's because I got an early start. Actually that joke used to work a lot better too when I still had hair and I didn't wear the reading glasses, but oh well, what can you do? And by the way, I did say Notre Dame. So I know all of you Georgia and Georgia Tech grads are going to go ahead and log off now because you won't listen to anything I say since you found that out. For those of you that might know him, in fact, the founder of our company is Nick Cavadellis, and Nick's a Tech grad himself. So I'm very used to his SEC football jokes about Notre Dame, trust me. And to make matters worse, in fact, I spent most of my life in St. Louis. So it's even worse now the last few years because Missouri's joined the SEC and they're not doing well if you've been following football at all. Anyway, all right, so enough of that foolishness. Let's talk about training. If you're like me, for most of your career, when you've been doing training, it's been in person, right? Whether it's formal or informal, you've been in a room where you can see and interact with your students. I started life myself as a university professor teaching in a classroom, right, filled with students. And then later I moved to commercial software training and the location might change. So now instead of a classroom, it's a conference room or a cubicle pod. But I can still look everybody in the eye and see who's paying attention, see who's got questions, or who just needs a break, right? And in that kind of delivery, the tools of the trade, right, are things like whiteboards and projectors and flip charts. I use a lot of props when I train because I think that drawing pictures helps people understand what I'm explaining. I've drawn that Tableau architecture diagram so many times on the whiteboard that my wife says I whisper about data sets and extracts in my sleep. So I don't know. We'll see what happens. And of course, when I first started teaching, there was no such thing as web conferencing. So the very first class I ever put together was on transparencies on an old-fashioned light projector. So any of you out there old enough to remember overhead projectors? Here, for those of you that never had the pleasure, here's an example of one. Very high-tech back in the day. Hopefully there's some of you that are old enough like me to remember that. Let me move on here. There we go. And at any rate, in an in-person model like that, when you're walking around the room, at the head of the classroom, I often refer to it as feeling like the king of the forest, right? We rule the room. We wander around, tell jokes, draw pictures, and you can gauge comprehension in real time, by looking at your students, looking at them in the eye, seeing who's paying attention, who's getting up, walking out. And then, of course, surprise, COVID comes along. Overnight we went from king of the forest to deer in the headlights, right? Suddenly we can't teach in person at all. Instead, we're all using virtual delivery with the attendees attending from home. You can't see anybody anymore. You can't see what they're doing, and you can't tell whether anybody's following along. So, I don't mean to make make it sound like this was all a surprise. I mean, some people have been using virtual training for a long time, right? Tableau's had virtual classes for a number of years. University of Phoenix has been out there for 30 years, right? So I don't mean that it was a complete surprise, but studies will show you that prior to COVID, less than 10% of training was delivered remotely. Now it's upwards of 70%. So for most of us, it's completely turned this software training world upside down, right? And so people are trying to adapt to this. Again, whether it's formal training or just informal training. You're used to doing a lunch and learn in the coffee room with your colleagues once a month. Now that's all being done online. And so in a world like this, our venue now is a home office rather than a classroom. We might be lucky enough to have a dedicated desk with dual monitors, but just as often I see people working from, a little spot they've nabbed on the kitchen table. So you just never know where you're going to be working from. And our new tools of the trade are things like webcams and headsets and speakerphones. We use web conferencing software like WebEx or Zoom. And if we're lucky, we get to use video to watch the students and kind of gauge reactions. But most of the time, I find people, even if they are at home and have a webcam, they don't like to turn them on, primarily because it means they have to dress up, right? So, how many of you have cheated a bit? How many of you are willing to admit you cheated a bit and kind of thrown on a dress shirt at the last minute, right? Does this look familiar? In today's home office culture, business casual often means business on top and casual below. So, and don't ask me what I look like right now because I'm not going to admit to anything. I'm not going to own it. So anyway, if you're like me, this is about where you start wondering, well, how do I do training online? How can I take my material that was designed for in-person delivery and still deliver a fun class, right, using the web? Well, luckily for me, my company started thinking about this a long time ago, well before anybody had ever heard of COVID. So we started putting techniques together to help us convert our in-person training to virtual. We tried to use cloud resources wherever we could to make it cheap. And then we had to develop, of course, some software that I would need as an instructor. And around that time, I started putting together kind of a patchwork of ideas, best practices, tips and tricks that I borrowed from a lot of different people. And over the time, I've kind of distilled these into a repeatable pattern. As I've said before, my specialty is software training. So most of my ideas focus on training for a software package, with some instructor-led content and some hands-on practice. And if you've ever taken one of Tableau's official courses, that's exactly the way Tableau does all of their training, right? It's little sections of content, and then you do a practice with some starter workbooks. Now, one of the things I'll mention today is, keep in mind that what I'm talking about is just part of a much larger presentation. So what I've tried to do is hone this down to things for this users group that focus on tips for Tableau training specifically. And I'll talk about what you need to know before you start teaching the class primarily. I've got a bunch of other suggestions that I often talk about, what to do during class and things to do after the class too. But I'm going to focus on just kind of that prep part of the world. So let's dive right into the first one. First and most important is to tailor the materials for online delivery, of course, right? Now, I know what you're thinking, right? You're thinking, well, that's a given, right? You have to. But trust me, I couldn't tell you how many online courses that I've attended where they're nothing more than a big, long WebEx slideshow. So people put their instructor slides and just spew for an hour. Now I'm not saying you have to rewrite your entire course, but there's definitely some things you have to consider that you wouldn't in a physical setting. So, for example, I think it's imperative to have hands-on practice. I think that's important in an in-person class too, but particularly for online, it keeps the students engaged. And as I mentioned, Tableau thinks this as well because all of their courses are built this way, both in-person and virtual. I've always used what I call a, say, show, do method. That's what I was taught when I first started teaching. You say what you need to say, you show an example of it, and then you have the students do it themselves. Just the other day, I was on with a customer, and I heard them talk about I do, we do, you do. And I thought that was kind of a cool way to say it too. The whole point is you're practicing what you preach, and you're giving students a chance to remember, to burn it into their head. So you've got to be able to do that. And I don't care if you're talking about a 25-minute seminar, where web and lunch and learn, where you're going to show somebody how to use Tableau, or if you're talking about a formal class. I think it's important. I also think that online classes need to be broken up into much smaller sections. So I might be able to keep a student's attention for an hour, but when I'm teaching online, it's more like 15 minutes, 20 minutes at the most. So when I'm standing in front of them, it could be an hour, but not so much, online. And remember when I said I like to draw a lot? For me, at least, drawing live on the computer screen is difficult. I mean, using the mouse is a nightmare. If I try and use my stylus, it's a little bit better, but I'm a terrible drawer to begin with. So most of my drawing ends up like some, finger painting project from preschool. So what I've done is I've created animated PowerPoint slides for every drawing I would do in the classroom. One of the very first things I did after I got my Tableau certification to train was to build a PowerPoint version of the Tableau architecture slide that builds upon itself. And I've shown that thing, I couldn't tell you how many hundreds of times. And as you can see, I like to use pictures and videos and things like that as well. We don't have time for a lot of video and interaction today because we're kind of honing this down to a 20-minute presentation. But the whole point is, as an instructor, I should know my topic well enough that I don't need these detailed word slides. There's nothing more boring than a presenter that just reads bullets word for word for word. We all fall asleep. So instead, the slides need to have just enough detail to remind me where I'm going, and the rest of the room should be, videos and graphics and things like that to keep people's attention. I also like to stop for feedback as often as I can. Of course, it can become tedious if I keep asking, do you have any questions? Do you have any questions? Do you have any questions? So I try and use whatever the online learning platform has, things like emoticons, chat window, and online polls. You guys are doing a great job right now, for example, of using the chat window, keeping things interactive, which is great. And we've got some co-presenters as well, which is always a great technique to get feedback. You can have other people asking questions and answering questions through the chat as well, so that it's not all on just you presenting. And then finally, don't forget to plan in breaks. As I said earlier, students need more breaks during an online class than they would in person. It's just more tiring to stare at a monitor than to watch a living person. And when students are sitting in front of you, of course, you can see what they're doing. You can see if they're getting restless, if people are getting up to go to the bathroom. But you can't do that online often. So you need to plan for breaks more frequently and maybe even time them with those practices, those hands-on examples that I talked about earlier. Okay, so then once your material is ready to go, the next thing is to find a technology. And this is often the hard part for a lot of people. And the funny part that I find is that most people never really look officially for a technology. Instead, they just start using whatever they have on hand and kind of live with the limitations. And I don't know, that might be your only choice too. Maybe you don't have the luxury of looking at tools. But if you do get a chance to look at something new, you might want to keep these kinds of requirements in mind. So first and foremost, you have to be able to broadcast your audio and computer screen to the students. I mean, that's a given, of course. So for most people, web meeting packages like the Zoom meeting we're using today is a great choice. It's got built-in audio, it's got built-in video, it has chat facilities, you've got some emoticons and things like that. So these tools are great, and I use Zoom practically every day myself. But keep in mind they were designed for meetings primarily and not for training. So there's going to be some other things that you're going to need that they probably won't have. So you need to look at the tools to either augment, supplement them, or to replace them in some cases. For example, I talked about how hands-on practice is critical. So that means that you're going to need an area for students to play with the software. Every student's going to need a working copy of the software for themselves. And a lot of people will handle this by asking the student to bring their laptop to class. When I do Tableau training in a company where we're teaching for one organization, a lot of times they'll bring their own machines to class. And this should work in theory, but keep in mind that not everybody does their homework, and people will come without the software installed, without the exercise files, or they'll come with an old version because they've never upgraded their machine. And so you end up losing a lot of class time just getting everybody set up. And so the good news is that there's a whole new class of tools that provides remote classrooms with this software installed. Orasi Labs, developed by my company, is just one of many products in this space, and we were not the first in the area, right? So tools like this give you dedicated labs for each student so that everybody has the right software installed. And these sandboxes, run in the cloud generally, and they're much cheaper than buying physical hardware. So it makes it really easy to start a new class because you've got everything you need right there in one place, and the students don't have to do any pre-work to get ready. Coupled with that, then, another critical feature is instructor monitoring. So as the instructor, I need to be able to see all of the students' screens while they're working. So, this is just like me as an instructor, wandering around the room, peeking over people's shoulders to see how things are going. I like to bring up a grid of the screens, on my machine in real time so that I can watch as they complete the task. I might use this to adjust my pace. So if I'm teaching, teach faster or slower, depending on how people follow along. Or I might use it to see if anybody's having trouble, if they've made a mistake or they've gotten stuck. Now, as I said earlier, you might be able to do some of this with Zoom or WebEx too, but there's limitations, like you can only see one screen at a time. The instructor has to stop to let the student share. You might even have to deal with privacy issues. So a dedicated monitoring tool is generally better. And for some people, you might even need the tool to support multiple training styles, right? So at a minimum, you need instructor-led courses like I've been talking about. But you might also want to introduce self-paced classes too. You might want to let the students take training on their own schedule. That'll give you some different ways for students to consume things and increase adoption overall. Now, one note I'll mention about all of this, of course, is that you're probably going to need some sort of dual monitor setup to make this work. So you're going to need one monitor to open up your lab and that your students can watch from, and then you're going to need another monitor where you can keep up with what the students are doing to monitor what they're doing. You might be able to do the same thing with a single monitor, of course, if it's large enough to support multiple windows and you can put them side by side and all that. But I like to use dual monitors so I can broadcast the one that has my sandbox on it, and then I can not broadcast the one that has all the student screens. So they can't see each other, but they can see me. Regardless, the idea is you need to keep an eye on your students without having to constantly ask if they're keeping up. Now, I'll just show you a real quick example of how this would work. So, it's going to be different in every tool, but like in a tool like Orasi Labs, the idea is you first start by building a virtual image. So this is where you install whatever the student needs. This is the gold image or gold master, whatever you want to call it. For Tableau training, this would mean this is where you put the Tableau desktop. You might even add a browser to access Tableau server, and you'll add all the starter workbooks that they need for practices. It's just like setting up the first machine in a physical classroom. If you've ever, taught for Tableau, they have third-party companies that set all this stuff up for you. If you've done it, yourself, then you've had to go through and build all these machines yourself. You might even need to set up Tableau server in a template too. So you might need multiple templates. In a desktop class, you'd want the students to have desktop, but you'd want one Tableau server that's shared across the whole class. For a Tableau server class, though, you'd probably put the Tableau server class right in the student sandbox. That way, everybody has their own copy to play with. So no matter how you do it, the point is you're building this template or multiple templates to become the master image that you use to create everything else in the lab. The second step then is to actually create the class. And the class, of course, is nothing more than a bunch of students, roster of emails or however you do it. You add the students to the class, you associate that to a template, and then you create the class, which will actually send out all the invitations and track participation. And then finally, at least with Orasi Labs as an example, when you're ready to start teaching, you just press the big green Start Class button, which delivers the class. So the tool then will create all of the dedicated labs, those things I've been calling sandboxes, for every participant, every student, and every instructor. The instructor would use their lab to teach, and the students use their lab to practice and play with the software. Again, this is exactly what you would do in a physical classroom. The difference, of course, is that the students could be thousands of miles apart, and they're sitting in their kitchen, at the table in a bathrobe, for all you know, right? I mean, the students don't need any software on their personal machine either, so you don't have to worry about them installing anything. They don't need any VPN software. You don't have to worry about Tableau licenses expiring or any of that kind of stuff. So it's an easy way to deploy this to whether it's 2 students or 200 students. The students then, on their side, they see an email with a link, much like a Zoom or WebEx, and then they press the Join Class button, which lets them open up the lab right in their browser. If you're teaching on Tableau Desktop, they'll have Tableau Desktop then running right in their browser. If you're teaching server, they might see multiple, one with the desktop and one with the server, and they can switch back and forth. Now, one note I'll make, I keep using instructor and student, but, again, keep in mind, if you're doing a lunch and learn with your coworkers, it's the same, kind of concept. So, spice it up, right? Have an hands-on lab for them to use. One of the very first classes I took for Tableau, the instructor had a Simpsons data set. So he liked the Simpsons cartoon, and he had a data set that showed how many donuts each character ate in each episode. And we used that data set then to learn custom mapping, to plot out the data, and have the size of the objects plotted onto a fictional map of Springfield. So that's obviously a sample I never forgot because of that one 5-minute exercise. So adding something unique like that makes it memorable for the students. And then finally, you got to monitor. So as I mentioned, the instructor needs to be able to see the students. So I need to be able to watch them in real time while I'm teaching, as well as while they're doing their labs. And if I need to, I might even be able to take over the control of their machine so that I can help them out if they make a mistake. And then the last tip I'll share with you today is, once you've selected your training platform, don't forget to practice. So we create what I call an open house beforehand. It's just kind of an online event where you let the students come in, you make it a fun thing, make it a happy hour where you offer, everybody brings a glass of wine or something, like that. I mean, spacing out over a couple of hours lets the students come in and out at their own convenience, and you just make sure everybody understands the technology. Might seem like a waste of time, but I've seen a lot of class time wasted because the students don't even know how to get started. So this helps kind of get over that hump. So there you go. Just a few tips for moving your Tableau training online. Tailor the material, look for an online learning technology that can support these hands-on labs that are critical, provides real-time monitoring, and then finally use an open house to orient them. And of course, when you look at all this, it sounds like simple, plain old common sense, right? And it is. I mean, I'm not going to lie and say I invented any of these techniques, but you'd be shocked, I'm sure, at how many of these simple ideas get overlooked by people when they're rushed to get online. When COVID hit and we all went online, a lot of people just started spewing on the web with, online PowerPoints. So I hope today I gave you some ideas to think about, some food for thought, some examples that you could apply in your world. And as I mentioned, this is just the small part of a larger presentation. So if you're interested in hearing any more, just let me know. In fact, I'll put up my contact information here in this last slide. Feel free to email me or go to our website and ask questions electronically. You can throw things in the chat as well. They'll send me a copy of the chat after the session, and I can answer questions offline too. So at this point, I guess I'll turn it back open to questions and turn it back over to either Anna or Nathan or somebody.
Hey, Joe, that was awesome, man. Really appreciate you sharing. And I think there's a ton of stuff in there that's just helpful. And hold on, let's make sure that I'm actually sharing the screen. Whoops. Hold on. I think I may have jumped the gun.
I was getting really excited about those talking points, Joe. As we talked earlier, we talked offline and earlier a couple months ago, and I do virtual training now. And just, yes, your talking points, the shorter sessions, and people can't just sit there in front of the screen. And the engagement, as much as you can try to be engaged, I use the emoticons too. Like, give me a green check if you're with me, give me a red X if you need that repeated. And just, but people, it's almost harder sometimes to just be stuck in front of like 2 screens. So I like to give a break every hour, just whether it's 5 or 15, they're getting breaks and breaks and breaks. And also that time, like you said, to work out the problem on their own. We really learn by struggle, right? So struggling through the process and figuring it out on our own to do that practice problem is helpful. Some people, let's see if anyone has any questions here. We're going to open it up for questions.
Somebody says they don't turn on their camera and just go with the robe. So I've been guilty of that myself, I'm afraid. But
I love that.
Yeah.
Anthony's our comedian, if you haven't met Anthony yet. I also loved the overhead projector. You get the I like to write with the blue one when I taught, and it would just get all down my arm.
Exactly. I have that problem with whiteboards even in there as well.
Oh yeah. I feel bad for left-handed people because it's just worse. Let's see. Let's get some questions going. Let's see if
I
anyone.
did feel bad that I couldn't have as much feedback in this session. I just gave a presentation on Tuesday to a national audience. It was a little bit longer, and so I tried to put some games in and stuff like that. I wasn't quite sure how much time we were going to have today, so I didn't put a lot of stuff in there. So, I'll owe you a bottle of wine or something, for the contest.
No, you're very engaging. You have a great presence. I like it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, awesome, y'all.
So, yeah,
go
if anyone
ahead.
has questions on whether you're going to move your team to virtual training or if it's even virtual meetings, as you said, a lunch and learn, it sounds like you've got so much experience in that. I've honestly had to learn the virtual side since March, and I've taught a lot virtually since March, but I don't think I could have presented on this before any of this. There's no way. So I'm used to in person.
Tablew's done a great job at enabling their trainers. So, I've been a Tableau trainer for a long time, and Tableau's released a, virtual enablement kind of session for all of us since March. They've been actively doing that. So they've done a great job at converting a lot of this to virtual. But not everybody has. I mean, there's a lot of companies who do Tableau training that are they're just taking their PowerPoints and throwing them up online, and that's all you see is a PowerPoint for 8 hours a day, which is, even if I'd fall asleep as an instructor doing that, much less as a student.
Let me ask you a question. Then we have a few questions here. Do you have an optimal number for people to train if you're training Tableau? And let's say people have dual monitors. So let's get that out of the way. We've got dual monitors. Everyone's got a mouse. They've got it all installed. We've got all those problems out of the way. What's the optimal number of people in a training course for Tableau?
That's a good question. When I teach online, Tableau's policy, right, is 12 to 15 at a max is what they say. But I've taught Tableau classes with 20 people in the room, and that's really tough to do, even in person. I think 12 is more like a kind of a practical max in person. Online, it can even be smaller because questions take longer, and I have a harder time following them. So what we usually say is that an instructor can keep up with about 6 to 10 students in the grid view, in the online view, realistically. So like a lot of our customers will have classes. We just had a hospital that did a bunch of training. They had up to 100 people in a classroom at a time. And so what they did then is they put 5 and 6 and 7 co-instructors watching different sets of students. So each person only had to watch 15, maybe a dozen at most, kind of students. So usually, in my opinion, it's kind of 10 is kind of the theoretical max that I can try and keep up with.
Yeah, and of course, sometimes it depends on the trainer. There's I'm kind of going out of order here. Someone said, any insights or research on the effectiveness of online versus in-person training when done correctly? And of course, I think this depends on the trainer. What do you think?
Yeah, that definitely depends upon the trainer and the materials, the way they've been adapted as well. Generally speaking, online training is less effective than in-person. Retention's a lot higher. So the average I've seen is that in-person training is about twice as effective as online. But online can vary. I mentioned in my presentation, in fact, I got some studies that show in early COVID days, retention was down at 10%. So everybody was just throwing their classes online. People were taking a class and they didn't remember more than 10% of what they saw. But, if you do it right and you do hands-on exercise and you do all this feedback and stuff like that, it can be up to 70%, which is approaching, an in-person class. So if it's done well, it can be as good as in-person, but most virtual training is not done as well, right?
It's hard, especially beginning of COVID when everyone was distracted. That was probably a key thing there too.
Exactly.
Rich asks, his workplace has a weird resistance to internal training, by the way. It's not weird, it's common, right? Do you have any
Yep.
tips on how to overcome that?
I like to, I mentioned a couple times lunch and learn. I like to do things off hours. Then the company is less likely to complain, but you got to make it fun, or else the employees aren't going to want to spend their off time doing this stuff, right? So that's one thing I like to do is I like to do a lot of lunch and learns. I do a lot of little half-hour things. When we're in person, of course, I incent people by buying the pizza, and that gets them to show up, right? They get a free lunch if they
Pizza
show up.
always works.
Yeah, it cost me $20 or $30 to order
Come help me move, or are you going to learn something? Either way, free pizza.
Yeah, exactly. That's harder to do in a virtual world, of course, because then, whatever. My company started doing things like we'll literally mail everybody a bottle of wine, and then we do an online happy hour.
Nice.
So it costs a little bit more though, because now you got to buy the bottle of wine and you got to ship it to everybody. So you got to have some
cheap?
Yeah.
Virtual candy.
There you go. That's a good idea.
I learned this from Emily Kunz. She gives out virtual candy in her classes. She's runs a Tableau podcast. But I started doing that, and people love virtual candy because there's no calories.
There you go. Oh, so there really isn't any candy. It's literally virtual.
It's whatever you want it to be. You want Halloween candy? Here you go. You get virtual candy. They think it's fun. Or they just laugh along with me or laugh at me. Whatever. Yeah. It works. It works. Incentives, right? Bragging rights.
Exactly.
Kahoot is a great way to engage people. I use that a lot. Have you tried that?
Yes, I have, and I love that. I mean, I watched your guys' little quiz there, and that's awesome. Especially because people can be anonymous. They can put in their, Captain Fizzlepants or whatever, and they don't have to admit when they make mistakes.
Exactly. It's good. Yeah. It's good. So do you have any advice? I know you just gave us advice for online training. Do you have any advice for, you just said the lunch and learn, but for people who want maybe not their whole organization, but their groups to be able to move forwards in step of, and like an on-premises training, maybe if it is during the day, but well, let me rephrase that, on premises or virtual, because now we don't know what that world's going to be like. But if they're going to move towards training, what's the best first step for looking for the best trainers or the best type of organization to do that work? Should they go through Tableau? How does that work?
Boy, that's a tough one. I mean, you guys are obviously in the Atlanta market, so there's a lot of trainers in the Atlanta market. There's a bunch of consulting companies that do it. My recommendation, of course, always to people when they ask me about getting like a consultant, I'll teach a Tableau class. Most of my training is done through Tableau, so I teach for Tableau.
Okay.
Some of you guys do as well. And so what I usually tell people is look for certifications first, right? I mean, people laugh about those certifications, but they're there for a reason. When I see somebody's a Tableau, certified professional, that means something. If I see a Zen master, forget it. I mean, they're light years ahead of me. I'll let them do anything. I'll hire them to do anything. So certifications are a big one. The other thing I would recommend is talking to your Tableau reps, the Tableau reps in your area, both technical and sales reps. They know who the good people are and who the bad people are. So they're a good sounding board. You got to be careful because sometimes they're getting, freebies on the side too. So, it's like watching reviews online. Everybody's opinions sometimes are colored by relationships and incentives, but nonetheless, they're good resources to draw from, I think.